The problem is that measures like this are very, very likely to disincentivize people from renting out property.
Well, this will have to mean rent controls. The wealth tax is not just a fiscal policy measure, it's really just an embodiment of this mindset of refusing to accept the existence of trade-offs, of scarcity, of saying we can have everything we want, it's just a matter of political will.
Increase taxes a lot now, and then you don't have to keep coming back year after year.
This is exactly what they said last year. Hello and welcome to the Institute of Economic Affairs podcast. I'm Callum Price, Director of Communications here. Today I'm joined by our Editorial Director, Kristian Niemietz, and our Managing Editor, Daniel Freeman. Now, happy Halloween, first and foremost. Secondly, if you want to hear more from the IEA, get all of our publications and our podcasts and our blogs and our events straight to your inbox, do subscribe to us on Substack, and don't forget to like, comment and subscribe on this video too, or wherever you get your podcasts. We do try and read all of the comments and really do genuinely quite appreciate the feedback. Now, that's the housekeeping out of the way. On to today's topics. There's quite a lot flying about as per usual, especially in the run-up to the budget. There's been a bill become an act this week that we'll get into, and also Javier Milei won a large victory in the Argentinian midterms. We'll be asking what that means for Argentina, but also what we can learn here in the UK from that. Now, to kick us off, Daniel, this week the Renters' Rights Bill became the Renters' Rights Act. Walk us through what that means and how much we should be worried about it.
Yeah, so this came into the law this week, having initially started out as a proposal under the Conservative government, under Michael Gove as Housing Secretary at the time. But it's sort of had support from both of the main parties and has now come through. So there are a few key aspects of this law that are sort of relevant to the private rental sector. So the first and perhaps the biggest one is that there's been an end to fixed term contracts. So previously you could rent out an apartment for say 12 months or 24 months or however long you really wanted. And then the landlord could say, okay, this is when we've agreed to, you move out after this, and give you 2 months notice and you move out. Now all contracts are automatically on a rolling basis, with the exception of some student contract. So that means that unless you do something wrong as a tenant, it's quite difficult for a landlord to say, okay, move on now. There are some situations in which the landlord can do this. So if you've been in place for over 12 months, and the landlord wants to sell the property or move in, then you can move out, but you need 4 months notice. So that's one aspect. There are a few others. So one is that it has made bidding unlawful. So for rent. So if a landlord says, okay, I'm going to rent out this house for £1,500 a month, you offer and he accepts an offer, he can't sort of say, okay, well, there's another guy saying 1,550 or whatever. And then finally, there are quite a few other bits and pieces, but another really significant and actually quite concerning aspect is that now if landlords want to increase rent rates, their existing tenants can take them to a tribunal, and the tribunal can determine whether whether the rent has sort of been increased to the local market rate. And if they think it's above the market rate, the tribunal can say, no, you can't set it that high. And also, but there's a crucial aspect of this, which I think some people haven't sort of appreciated how significant it might be, is that while this case is going to the tribunal, rent is fixed at the previous existing rate. So basically, you're in a situation where if you are a tenant and your landlord puts up your rent by any rate at all, even if the overall decision is likely to be like, yeah, this is fine, this is just to the market rate or even below it, you have every incentive to put in a complaint to a tribunal. And if it takes months, or maybe if lots and lots of people start doing this and you get the tribunal system being massively overburdened, maybe it ends up dragging into years, you basically just get a fixed rate rental agreement, which can't go up very much. Now, from one perspective, a lot of tenants will be thinking, oh, wow, this sounds great. I can just jam up any rent increases indefinitely, or not quite indefinitely, but for a protracted period of time. This is wonderful. Well, the problem is that measures like this are very, very likely to disincentivize people from renting out property. Because if you make it much more difficult to get rid of problem tenants, or if you just sort of think, okay, I want to rent out this property for a short period of time, maybe I want to, do something else with it later. And if you make it really, really difficult to increase rents, really, really difficult to remove people, you are less likely to want to rent out property. So what you'll get is probably an acceleration of what's already happened over the last 5 to 10 years, is that you get increasingly landlords leaving the private rental sector, selling up, which sometimes people say, oh, well, that sounds good. You get more owner occupation. Now, it is good if you happen to be in a position to buy a house at this stage, because it may mean you end up getting something relatively cheaper than you otherwise would have. But it's really, really bad if you are, say, a young professional who wants to move to a different city to find work or for whatever reason, because it means there is a lower supply of private rental properties. And that means that the market rate will almost certainly go up, quality will almost certainly go down, and you'll end up in this kind of vicious cycle where, because we are constraining the supply of this goods through various aspects of government regulation, the cost and quality decreases. And then you're in a situation, wow, it's even worse. We need to impose more strict regulation. And then you just get this general doom loop. And this is really, really bad, because if one of the big advantages of having a private rental sector is, one, it allows you to use the existing housing stock much more efficiently than you can with really high levels of owner occupancy, because very few people in their 20s want to buy a house with 4 friends from university. People only tend to buy houses with their spouse, basically, which means that the existing housing stock it tends to be restrained. And then also you have a reduction in labour mobility. It makes it more difficult for people to move to where jobs and economic opportunities are. It grinds everything to a halt and just makes everything worse.
Kristian,
summary.
Yeah, I mean, that's basically it, isn't it? It seems to me that it's both rent control and reducing the supply of housing in all but name. Those are the two sort of major unintended consequences of this.
Yes, so it is definitely a form of rent control through the back door. And I remember writing about this when this idea was first discussed. So the ending of no-fault evictions, I think it was under Theresa May already. And I said at the time, well, this will have to mean rent controls, because if you say you cannot have fixed-term contracts, if rental agreements are effectively open-ended, cannot be unilaterally ended by the landlord unless it's for a predefined set of conditions, well, that leaves a loophole. What if I'm the landlord? What if I say, okay, you can stay there. I'm not kicking you out. However, from tomorrow on, the rent goes up to £1 billion. I'm not kicking you out. As long as you pay your billion, you can stay there forever. Well, there will have to be a law to stop me from doing that. And how do you do that? Even if you don't want to bring in rent controls in the sense of purely administratively set prices, you will have to peg it to something. You will have to come up with some limit. In this case, what they're trying to do is limit rent increases to the local market rate. So they're still saying there is a place for market signals, but only in the aggregate. But you individually cannot do anything about that, which is going to create lots of problems, because then every time a landlord wants to increase rents, they will say, okay, we're going above this so-called market rate index that you have for the region. However, my place is different. I have this feature or that feature, therefore it's fine if I charge more. And then you will have bureaucrats haggling over that. That in itself doesn't even have to be a terrible thing. So there was something like that in Berlin before. Berlin had, at the end of the last decade, they had hard rent controls, which led to quite quickly a dramatic drop in the supply of rental properties. So that was really the revenge of the Econ 101 textbook, where every economist said this was going to happen, and then the socialist government brought it in anyway. Obviously, what every economist predicted would happen did happen. Before that, less well studied, they had a softer version of rent controls where they said, well, we're just going to limit rent increases to local market rents, but in order to work out what the local market rent is, we're going to make various adjustments. And it was so complicated that it was basically impossible for a tenant to really enforce it. And as a result, it didn't have much impact. And that can mean, if that's the way in which your rent controls work, if they're just unenforceable in practice, that's the least bad form of rent controls, because they only exist on paper. What we have here is a version of that, except the one difference is, well, what you mentioned, that as long as you challenge it, as long as you challenge the landlord's decision, you can keep paying the old rent. And that's the big difference to the Berlin situation, where unless the court says, yes, what the landlord has done is wrong and this is illegitimate, you would have to pay.
Yeah,
that's the big difference.
Also, a really crucial aspect of that is, even if the tribunal later says, like, after, say, 3 months or whatever, no, the new rate is totally fine, it's in line with the market rate, you don't have to repay the difference. You still have your old rent kept. So we've created a system where every single tenant in the country has a huge incentive to respond to any rent increase by taking it to a tribunal. And that makes the situation worse, because if you have millions of people going to these tribunals, it's going to take a lot longer to get any sort of decision, and this is going to make the problem worse and worse.
And the British justice system isn't exactly known for its quickness or efficiency at the moment already. So,
well, there's only a couple of dozen of these tribunal people right now, unless, they could, I guess, train new ones and expand that into a massive bureaucracy. And then it would be like the equivalent of what we talked about, I think last time, the wealth tax valuation bureaucracy. You would need an equivalent of that for the rental sector. So the least bad thing that could happen is, you could imagine that most tenants are just not aware of this legislation and just won't make use of it, or maybe don't want to go through the hassle, don't want to fall out with their landlord, because it would be a bit awkward living in a place where you're also in an active court case against the person who owns that property. So that would maybe be the least bad outcome, that most people just don't make use of these possibilities. But of course, some people will. And then it will be like, well, like a lot of cases, like where, say, bad faith anti-discrimination legislation, where it may just be a small number who take advantage of the legal loopholes and use it in bad faith. But from the perspective of, well, in that case, the landlord, in an employment tribunal case, the employer, just the fact that there are a few cases of that nature, that the system can be abused, well, that's an extra risk, and you will take it into account. Well, what did I say? Yeah. What it will mean specifically in the rental sector is, of course, a risk premium.
Yeah.
That you will charge.
It's a good example of the power of a good line, I think, in that basically branding it no-fault evictions makes it seem like something far worse than it actually is. Rather than just people reaching the end of a mutually agreed contract, it's painted as being this thing, oh, well, don't we all think that no-fault evictions, people being booted out of where they live for absolutely no reason at all, at the drop of a hat, shouldn't that be illegal? Well, funnily enough, that is already illegal. But what do we think then? How much of this problem is going to be embedded long-term? Or do you think the results will be so bad that there will be a quick incentive to repeal it, maybe not by this government, but by an incoming government?
Well, I mean, there's not a very encouraging history when it comes to temporary measures on rent. So in Britain, the first rent control came in World War One as a temporary war measure that I think it was 1915, and remained in place in some form until the late 1980s, and played a big role in the explanation for the really rapid or really extensive decline in the private rental sector, that it just became a really poor investment choice in most parts of the country to be a private landlord, and we'll probably see something along similar lines today. I mean, Scotland has had some of these measures in place since 2017, and we have seen, I think, about 8% of landlords leaving the market. I mean, we've also seen some of this in the UK on the whole in response to significantly less favourable tax treatment that was brought in first by George Osborne, but has continued over the last decade. So higher rates of stamp duty for landlords, no longer being allowed to treat mortgage interest as a business expense. All of these have combined to result in a situation where the number of private rental dwellings has actually declined slightly between 2016 and 2022, while the overall number of properties has increased a bit. But yeah, I mean, I think part of the problem is that both the left doesn't really like the private rental sector for fairly obvious reasons. They're averse to landlordism, but the right in Britain has also been has had a pretty mixed relationship with the private rental sector, largely because there's this sort of idea that you need to try and shift as many people into owner occupation, because there's an idea that if people are owner occupiers, they just sort of automatically become Tories. And I think that's actually, at certain points in history, that was true. I think now that's not the case, and we actually see this in polling of people in their 20s and 30s who do happen to have a mortgages. They're not significantly more right wing, and it's largely, I think, because the problem is, and you can say this is the problem with the British economy and British politics overall, is housing is just too expensive. So it doesn't really matter if you're, in really expensive rental accommodation or in an incredibly expensive house that you're having to spend huge amounts of your income on a mortgage. The problem is housing is too expensive. That is downstream from 70 years of really, really poor state regulation, particularly in land use law. But that's the problem with a lot of government intervention. You introduce some poorly thought through intervention that ends up creating massive problems. People say, oh, look, the market isn't solving this problem. Therefore, we need more intervention, more regulation on the market, which then drives people out of that market. You get less supply. So prices go up, quality goes down, but people blame capitalism or landlords or neoliberalism or the ghost of Margaret Thatcher rather than the actual underlying causes of this.
Yeah, I'm not aware of any example either of rent controls or something like rent controls being rapidly repealed. So there is the showcase example of Stockholm, where They've had rent controls for a long time. It's been well studied, and I guess every economist who looks at this knows this is a terrible example, where you can literally look this up on a borrow by borrow basis, the waiting lists for the rent control properties in Stockholm, and it's always measured in years. In some cases, it's more than 10 years. I remember looking this up once where I thought, well, this cannot be right. They have these distributional figures where they show the median and waiting time and the mean waiting time and the tail end. And in some places, it's 12 years and more than that. I first thought this can't be right. I'm probably just reading this wrong because the website is in Swedish or something. No, it's really true. They have waiting times of several years. It's a completely dysfunctional market, if you even want to call it a market. But they seem to be unable to do much about it. And in the Berlin case that I mentioned, where you had the evidence being in very quickly, several studies showing rental supply of new rental properties is collapsing when it's rising in several of the cities elsewhere in the country. Even there, that didn't trigger a reform. It was purely a matter of luck that they didn't keep the rent control, because there it was the Constitutional Court which said no, the city of Berlin doesn't have the right to unilaterally impose rent controls. So for constitutional reasons, you can't do it just here. And even then, the politicians involved said, well, okay, we have to scrap this now because the Federal Constitutional Court said it. But what this shows is that we were totally right, and we just need to do it on a nationwide basis. Real rent controls have never been tried. And it's not, I'm really not aware of an example where a government said, okay, we have the economic evidence in. It shows that this doesn't produce the results that we want. Therefore, we will just scrap it. The problem with rent controls is that they create short-term winners, and then they are a constituency and you don't want to upset them. And you have, as with development in general, the beneficiaries of doing the right thing are in the future, and you can only identify them once you've already done the right thing. And but then too late.
Indeed. Let's move on to the next topic. This week there's been, Kristian, a bit of a debate in the pages of the Times and elsewhere about different models of growth and different theories of growth. Do you want to just talk us through what that debate is and where you come down on it?
Well, yes, it was a debate essentially between William Hague and our former colleague Ryan Bourne. Hague said, well, he wrote a silly article where he said it was explicitly against the idea of build, baby, build. That slogan used by some people in the current government, well, I guess by us as well. The YIMBY abundance slogan. William Hague said, no, it's not build, baby, build. What you need is think, baby, think. The idea being, and he was referring to the Nobel Prize in economics that we also talked about here. Yes, the idea being that in the long run, economic growth, productivity growth, prosperity doesn't come from just building more physical stuff. It comes from new ideas and innovation and new ways of organizing activity. That's the long-term driver of growth, and therefore that's what we should be thinking about, rather than just building more physical stuff. Now, okay, in the long term, this is of course true. It's in a trivial sense correct. Of course, the long-term driver of prosperity is innovation, technological and organizational innovation. That's what makes us rich in the long term. Nobody disputes that. If there was somebody in the country who said, let's not bother with innovation, let's just have more buildings, then William Hague would have totally destroyed that person. It's just no such person exists. So therefore, it's not quite clear who is arguing against there. The issue is just that well, okay, going back to the argument, of course, it's true that if we compare the economy of today to the way it was 100 years ago, of course, what makes us richer isn't that we have bigger factories than in 1925 or that we have more blast furnaces to make iron and coal and stuff. Of course, we have fewer people working in coal mines and more people doing podcasts. And that's great. I prefer to be here than I prefer being here to being in a coal mine. All great stuff. It's just, nonetheless, innovation needs to take place somewhere, right? You still need physical infrastructure, physical buildings, premises, and energy, and you need people being able to live nearby. And especially once a company or sector, once you've had the innovation, once you've had your new business idea, your breakthrough technology, or your organizational innovation that enables you to do things that you couldn't do before, that's great, but that now your company or your sector has to grow. And that growth has to be accommodated in some way. You need the buildings in which that can take place. You need people being able to live nearby, move to the area, and ideally the infrastructure to connect them and the energy to power that. And that is what's holding us back right now. Britain doesn't have specifically an innovation problem. There are startup companies, there are universities that produce new ideas. It's just so the usual bottlenecks are, say, the life sciences industry is one of those industries that always come up. Great as far as it goes, but if you ask them what's holding you back, they say we can't find any lab space. That's why we're emigrating to places in the United States where they do have that. And okay, this isn't specifically a British problem. For other reasons, it happens in most of Western Europe as well. So I've just published something in Economic Affairs, which was a review of 2 books that talk about, we've had this shift. There was a couple of years ago, you had people talking about the German economy as this great role model. Books with titles like Why the Germans Do It Better, Notes from a Grown-Up Country, I think was the title, the subtitle. And now you have books with titles like Kaputt, Broken Republic, and The End of the German Miracle. I was reviewing those, and they are full of case studies of exactly those kinds of problems for slightly different reasons. But they where when people ask why aren't they innovating anymore, the authors of these books are saying, well, they are. You have people coming up with brilliant business ideas, just that then they run up against the bureaucracy, and then once they've had their innovative idea, they emigrate and bring it to the United States or somewhere else. And so the innovation, that isn't the bottleneck. It's not that. That's why this comparison with this reference to the Nobel Prize isn't really quite appropriate, because what Mocke was talking about and other people like him was that what a revolution this was at the time, that you had this idea that people can come up with new technologies and scientific breakthroughs, and that you also applied this to economic life rather than just being an end in itself. And that was really what set Europe apart at the time from the rest of the world, and for a while specifically Britain, even from the rest of Europe, why the Industrial Revolution happened a generation earlier here. And okay, if you start from a world where you don't have scientific breakthroughs, or where you have, say, where people cannot just put them into practice, but where economic life is determined by, say, religious authorities who say, no, we have to preserve the traditional way of doing things, then that's obviously great. It's just that's not where we are today. If you have innovative ideas, it's not that there's some clergyman who will tell you that this is sinful, that you're not allowed to do it. What's much more likely to happen is that you can't find a place where you can open your business. And even if you have that and you're a small scale business now, you can't expand. And for that, you need the physical building. So the fact that in the long run, of course, it's innovation that matters, and it's breakthroughs and technology and all that. Nonetheless, that doesn't mean that the physical infrastructure to accommodate that is irrelevant, and that we can just block all that and cut it off and hope that somehow people will still have ideas just somehow in a vacuum sitting around in an empty space, and that we will have a completely an economy that is just completely detached from anything physical.
Mm-hmm. So it's a false dichotomy between build, you think, baby, think, and build, baby, build.
Yeah, it's totally false, and it's also, as it happens, a complete garbling of what Mocke argued. Like one of the things Mocke points out, actually, in one of his most interesting papers, is it's not. What drives British industrialization is partly that you have this elite that's interested in innovation, but it's also that you have sort of relatively humble craftsmen who have many of the skills that are actually quite useful in industrialization. And this, in turn, is downstream from capital already existing physical buildings. So what Mocke has done, for example, is track the number of mills in an area from the Doomsday Book in the 11th century. tracked them through to the 17th century and found that areas that have a higher density of mills also have a higher density of skilled workers who are there to repair these mills. And you can still see the effect of that in the Industrial Revolution into the 19th century, because you have these people who are able to work on, bits of capital equipment, and that can transfer quite well into industries that didn't even exist in 1700, say. And it's very much a bottom-up thing. It's not like the English state in 1700 was saying, we must have lots of mill rights because they will help us industrialize in 50 years' time. No, it was that you had a sort of a system of property rights and systems of credit that allowed lots of mills to be constructed, that meant there was demand for these skills in the British economy, and then they could be transferred quite easily, especially when you have a big concentration of these people in one area. And I think that speaks to the broader point in general, that ideas are produced by people, and people are corporeal beings who have to exist in physical space. So, people have been talking about this idea that, agglomeration benefits, when you get people together and they all have ideas and in a sort of particular city, that's going to break down. People were talking about this when the telephone was introduced, that this will mean that cities will no longer need to exist. Everyone can live all over the place. And people said it again when the email was introduced. People were saying it endlessly during COVID, that you don't actually need to have people living together or living in close proximity to produce these ideas and these benefits from agglomeration. But everything we've seen over the last 100+ years seems to have suggested that actually agglomeration benefits are growing in importance, not declining. And in order to get these benefits, you do have to allow people to move to places, people and businesses to move to places where there are other people and businesses in that sort of same area. And to do that, you need to have lab space, you need to have housing, you need to have infrastructure. And those are the things that we're really bad at in the British economy. We're not bad at thinking. That's not the issue. It's all of the other stuff that allows people to think and get together.
It's the sort of foundational stuff. And it's the foundations paper that we've talked about a lot, and also the government's whole narrative about fixing the foundations. That does seem to be Britain's problem. Differing views on how important and how successful the government are in addressing those. But that's where the bottleneck is. We are quite clever as a nation, if you like, and we've got those universities, etc. But we just don't have the infrastructure to get to those people, get the people to those places to have those ideas.
Yeah, so the Hague article would have been a fair criticism of, say, the economy of the Soviet Union in the 1930s. There you could have said, okay, you guys have built some factories now that you've imported from the West, and good, well done. You can now produce some coal and steel. But if you want to grow further from there, you can't just have bigger factories and more of the same machines. At some point, you will have to become a bit more innovative. And if you're not getting there, then maybe you should rethink your economic system. That would have been a fair criticism. But that is just not where we are now. Even to the extent that there is a focus on physical buildings, most of that does not come from a government drive. So if you had some central planning agency that just said we need to build lots of stuff here and there and we will work out where, then maybe that would be a fairer criticism. But the demand for more building comes mostly from the private sector. And if we had an economy where that was no longer needed, where companies just found out, okay, we have our premises are big enough, we have all the physical infrastructure here. What we need is, say, more software or different types of skill. We need to train our workforce in a different way. Well, then, okay, sure. Then that will be on their initiative. Then they will change their priorities, and then innovation will be produced in this way. It's just that right now there quite clearly is a demand for, we can see this in office rents and things like that. There clearly is a demand outstripping supply of some of the basics, of some of the the physical space in which economic activity takes place, and there just isn't enough of it, and it's just market signals telling us that.
Mm-hmm. To move on to our last and final topic, this week Javier Milei basically had his first national test of his popularity since he took over, and there's been some local elections and whatnot, but these were the midterm elections in Argentina. After the sort of progress that he's made since, this is the first big test, and he passed it with flying colours, is the general consensus. Despite some doubters beforehand, he won nearly 41% of the vote, taking 13 of the 24 Senate seats and 64 of the 127 lower house seats that were contested, which means a lot of things. Firstly, that it is a vote of confidence in his plan so far. It means that he now has the numbers to resist any attempt to increase the spending, once again, undo some of the work he's done from Congress. But if you want to listen to what it really means for Argentina, then I interviewed Axel Kaiser, one of his friends and advisors, and a fellow wonk from South America on the podcast a couple of days ago. So go and listen to that. What I'm interested in discussing here with you both is, what can Britain, the UK and Europe learn from this? The Economist wrote it up as, I think correctly, his success shows the power of tough but coherent economic messages that are proclaimed with clarity and conviction. Do we think that something similar could happen in the United Kingdom, or do things need to get worse before they get better on that front?
Well, I think we've talked about this before, I'm not an accelerationist, because I think right now, if things turn terrible, we would draw the wrong conclusions and the political situation would get even worse. But the general lesson from Milei, and I don't know nearly enough about Argentinian politics to talk about that competently. I would just say the one slogan that we've adopted from him is afuera, out. And that may seem simplistic, the way he's presented this, that he was standing in front of this whiteboard and just ripping off labels that represent government departments. But what it shows us, he has an idea in his mind, a mental model of what he thinks the government should do. Now, whether he has a roadmap to get there, I don't know whether he can get that through, or whether whether his actual reform plan is particularly consistent with that, I don't know. But that's a good place to start. And this afuera plan isn't even completely novel. So that there was, I don't know whether he was modeling it on that, but there was, I saw an interview once with Milton Friedman, where the interviewer was just presenting a list of government departments, public sector organizations, and was just asking Milton Friedman, what would you do with those? And to most of them, Friedman just said, well, abolish. So that was basically afuera. And that's clearly a contrast to, say, the fiscal consolidation plans that we saw here. So I remember writing about this when the term austerity came up, early 2010s. There you really had the problem that the Cameron-Osborne government, Cameron, Clegg, Osborne, their idea of fiscal consolidation was really that the state would keep doing everything that it does now, just a bit less of each activity. And so you had these very unsystematic ways of saving money. There was, for example, a lot of the savings in the early Cameron years really came from changing the way, the rate at which, the way in which benefit payments, transfer payments were updated. So in a lot of cases, it meant a switching from retail price index uprating to consumer price index uprating, not because they thought this is a better measure of the true rate of inflation of where consumer prices are going, but simply because CPI usually produced lower rates than RPI, and they just thought if we use this measure, the payments will go up at a lower rate and we will save some money. And okay, it's true, it did. It's just a very unsystematic way of doing it, and that is why it ultimately didn't amount to much. So you had some savings, some fiscal savings initially. It's just, if we look at the fiscal situation today, it's clearly far worse than it was in the early 2010s. We now have debt levels of around 95%, getting closer and closer to 100% of GDP, where there was a time when it was really only Japan, which had, in the developed world, which had figures like that. the fiscal situation is clearly worse than it was then. And what makes matters worse is that, at least in the early 2010s, that there was some acceptance so that something has to happen. It was not entirely unpopular, even though all the individual measures were, but there was some acceptance that as a package, something has to happen. That is not there now. Now, what's the big topic of the day? It's the wealth tax. And that is clearly, that embodies, the wealth tax is not just a fiscal policy measure. It's really just an embodiment of this mindset of refusing to accept the existence of trade-offs, of scarcity, of saying we can have everything we want. It's just a matter of political will. And what Millet has really done differently is that right from the start he had this idea: this is what I think the government should do, this is what it shouldn't do, and that was embodied in this Afuera video, and that's why we've made that a series of where, as we did in the Cameron Clegg Osborne days, where we had this book Sharper Axes, Lower Taxes, where we asked several people who were experts in particular fields of particular areas of government spending, asked them, if you were in charge of government spending in this area, what would you do? Because then you wouldn't just say, I'll change the uprating formula here a little bit. You would start by saying, what do I want the government to do? There can be nothing, depending on what the area is. In some areas, it would just be somebody saying, well, afuera, out, that's it, short chapter. And as it happens, it was a bit more than that. It was mostly people saying, well, here are some core functions. Those I wish to preserve. It can even be, in some isolated cases, you may even want higher spending in some areas. But in the round, it clearly meant these authors identified activities of the British state that they thought these should not be state activities. Throw them out entirely. And then you can make savings in a very different way, in a much more strategic way.
Exactly. And as always, do subscribe to Insider at substack.org.uk to see each episode of that series that we are doing. Dan, as Kristian pointed out, the wealth tax is the sort of mot du jour at the moment. But more broadly, actually, everybody's anticipating more huge tax rises after loads last year from the Chancellor at the budget coming up. Simultaneously, the government is experiencing almost record low polling rates. I think on one poll they were less popular than Prince Andrew or no longer. So is there a sense in which actually people are getting quite fed up with this and would be more amenable to some spending cuts?
Yeah, I mean, I think people in Britain are generally fed up with the government, but the problem is that doesn't seem to translate into particularly favourable opinions of anyone else in politics. So if you look at, say, you have Reform, which is hovering a little under 30% in the polls, but Nigel Farage's approval ratings are sort of not Keir Starmer levels, but they're still really bad. They're still below zero. So it's not like there's a sort of clear alternative who's there sort of waiting in the wings. But we'll see, I suppose. I mean, one argument that has been used by commentators for the government using this budget to basically do all the tax rises they're going to is that the next election is still 3 years away. So perhaps the argument is you increase taxes a lot now, and then you don't have to keep coming back year after year.
Which is exactly what they said last year.
That is the main problem with this. One of the problems with this is that sort of the demands on government spending, especially under a Labour government, tend to expand to meet the revenue they're getting in. So if say the Chancellor currently, well, the theory was from the last budget that she'd have about £10 billion worth of headroom in terms of spending. Now the lower the productivity figures, which have been the OBR's productivity figures, which have been revised down, suggest that she'll probably have to fill in an extra gap of about 20 to 30 billion pounds. So, which is obviously more than the headroom. So one argument is that you increase the headroom sort of to 20 billion, 30 billion, 40 billion, so that if anything else comes up, you don't have to raise taxes again. Problem is, then you have a long sort of column of backbench MPs and ministers who come to you saying, oh, well, we've got quite a lot of headroom. Why don't we just, X circumstance has happened. We should increase X benefit to respond to that. We should do X thing. It's only a few billion. That threat will increase. And so far, the government hasn't shown itself particularly to be particularly firm in resisting calls for higher spending.
And they've also this week they've shelved plans to rein in the increase in the disability benefit.
Yeah, that's just going up in real terms till the end of this parliament. That's the assumption.
So we're looking down the barrel then of a tax rising budget, which is we've all baked into our forecasts already. But is there, because of what you said, because of them saying they'd go away last year, the huge tax rising budget, but then we won't have to come back come back again with the same thing. They're going to do that this time round. They're clearly incapable of cutting any government expenditure. Is there a point at which this then gets to people realise that, because the disaffection with politics goes beyond public expenditure, right, and tax rates. It's about immigration, it's about all sorts of things. But what can we do to ensure that actually the sort of to push the mood in the direction of actually what needs to happen here is a British Afuera? Is there anybody out there that is going to say that? I mean, Farage and Kemi are both saying bits of it, but maybe not as much. Or are we just going to be stuck in this doom loop until we have the Argentina problem?
But they do have a way out. They were starting with, the reason why some of us here were mildly hopeful about the government in the early days was that they seemed to have had this last-minute conversion to YIMBYism, abundance, which is perfectly compatible with a centre-left perspective, and no reason why they shouldn't do it. It's just that they seem to have lost interest in that, or bogged down in the fiscal details. But all of this ultimately goes back to economic growth, and that's the problem here. That if you have a stagnant economy, everything becomes zero-sum. You have increasing demands on the state; they can't seem to get any cuts through, but there isn't much willingness to increase taxes, and therefore you just get demands for economic fantasy, basically. The idea. And I don't want to become, I don't want to keep banging on about the wealth tax like a sort of anti-evil Gary Stevenson, but I think it really just encapsulates this mindset that you get when an irresistible force hits an immovable object, that you get these demands for this is a form of escapism, really. Yeah. This fantasy that there are limitless resources that are already there. You just need the courage to tap into them.
Yeah. The one neat trick to solve that they don't want the public finances. Yeah. The bond markets don't want you to know about this.
I think that's entirely correct and entirely depressing, but that's why we're here, and that's why you listen to this podcast. For more depressing news from the IEA, do follow us on Insider, on Substack, on YouTube, and wherever you get your podcasts. Thank you very much for joining us, and we will see you next time.